So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this wonderful celebratory event. I bring you the regrets of Professor Chana Wirth-Nesher, who's the director of the Goldreich Institute, who fell ill last night and wrote to me this morning saying that she really wasn't feeling well and asked me to stand in her place and to read her introductory remarks and act as moderator of today's panel. I teach Yiddish literature at Smith College in Massachusetts, and it's really a wonderful pleasure to be here for this event. We're joined today by a number of distinguished guests. In addition to members of the faculty of this program, we also have today Nadav Kadar, Naomi's son, who will say a few words in a moment, and Lindsay Bodner and Ilana Koritsky. Today's symposium will go as follows. We'll have two academic talks by two very distinguished academics who I will introduce in a few moments. And then at the end, we will have a musical performance by our very own Yuri Vendenyapin. But first, Chana asked me to read her remarks, which I will do now. Books outlive us. For authors, a book launch is a celebration, a kind of birth, a coming out into the world after the solitude of writing and a letting go of what they have crafted in private. Today, we celebrate the birth of Naomi Prawer Kadar's book, one that began as a dissertation, that is the fruit of hours of research, exploration, and writing, solitary work, the quiet moments of discovery, the joys of scholarship that many of us know, the great anticipation of seeing our contribution to knowledge published, that is literally made public. We wish, of course, that the author, Naomi, could reap the joy of her labors today. Over the years, we have reminded our students, all of you, that the person for whom this summer program is named and is devoted was a superb teacher. Today, we have an opportunity to celebrate another dimension of her being, Naomi as a superb scholar and writer. The choice of her topic is in keeping with her respect for the teaching profession, for the role of educators, as it is a detailed look at periodicals in Yiddish that were available to American children during a period when Yiddish in America was at its peak. Children's literature was not immune to ideology and politics. On the contrary, what arena could be more passionate than Erziehung, raising children with everything that such a word connotes? Children are the future, and educators pin their hopes on changing the world to fit their social blueprints. So it is no surprise that there were 4 secular Yiddish school networks, each with its own distinct and distinctive view of the world. No one had studied this systematically before, and now we have a full and rich account. In this elegant and very, very handsomely produced book that we have on the table over there, which adds a fascinating aspect to the story of Yiddish in America and globally. One of the most compelling characteristics of this book is that although it is written in English, the tender sound of Yiddish diminutives about educating little people softens the prose. These interspersed italicized words from poems and other writings convey warmth in an otherwise scholarly genre. Grinike Bemelech, Kadishlich, Yiddische Hitlich, and boys referred to as Armeishelich and Schlemelich. Always attuned to the social messages conveyed in these periodicals, Naomi notices that the pen and ink drawing on the cover of Die Jiddische Kinderwelt is of 3 little boys with covered heads, while the cover of Kinderjournal is a girl on a swing, skirts billowing in the wind. In her words, quote, "This not only makes a statement about establishing a distance from traditional religious values, but also suggests a recognition of the expanded possibilities that America offers with regard to gender." Finally, Chana and I were deeply impressed by the way Naomi paid equal attention to the international and to the American aspects of these magazines. For example, the multiracial group of children on the cover of Jungvar in May 1939, carrying the banner Der Erster Mai unser Jontef. She juxtaposes this to a dramatic icon of the communist icon in America, the African-American Paul Robeson. Now, I invite, for a few brief comments, Naomi's son, Nadav, to welcome you to this event.
Hi. I didn't wasn't aware that I was going to speak, but I wanted to personally think is that I was very much involved while my mother was writing the dissertation. She really spent a lot of days and times, and I was also happened to be in the Judaic Studies program at Brandis at the time, so we would talk about what I was studying and what you were studying, and she really would have been happy to see this book published. And unfortunately, she did not get the chance to, but in the last year, we worked with a very talented editor, and Bani, and she really did a good job in taking all the manuscripts, the original manuscript and the final dissertation, and intertwining it to this book. And it's amazing to see what it became without her. And I'm glad that you guys are all here, and we had a lot of good receptions and a lot of good reviews of it, and she would be happy if she was here today. So I wanted to thank everyone for being here, and thank you. And thank you, Roskies, for being the dissertation advisor and good friend.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, my friend and my teacher, David Roskies, known to us here at Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University, where he teaches also, as Lehrer Roskies. It would take really too long to do justice to his illustrious career. David G. Roskies is the Saul and Evelyn Henkind Chair in Yiddish Literature and Culture and a professor of Jewish literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Since 2013, he has also served as the Naomi Prawer Kadar Visiting Professor of Yiddish Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012. Among his many, many accomplishments are the following volumes: Holocaust Literature, Yiddish Lands, which if you haven't read, you need to go and run to get a copy and read this memoir of growing up in Yiddish, The Jewish Search for a Usable Past, A Bridge of Longing, The Lost Art of Yiddish Storytelling, Against the Apocalypse, Responses to Catastrophe in Modern Jewish Culture, and also served as editor of the Dibuk and Other Writings, The Literature of Destruction, the Shtetl book, and I know that given the short time between his passing and now, he would also want me to mention that he co-founded the most prestigious and important journal of Jewish literary history in the world, Proof Texts, with the late Alan Mintz. He was instrumental in getting this book published and edited. Here is what Naomi had to say about David Roskies in her acknowledgments when she submitted her dissertation. Quote, "It was my extreme good fortune and honor to work with David Roskies. His gentle mentoring, his extensive knowledge, his absolute clarity of vision, and his ever-present warmth made each trip to his office an enriching experience that left a lasting imprint on my work." The title of his talk today, Some Thoughts on the Invention of Yiddish Childhood. David.
America. America was home to much of what we value most about Yiddish literature and culture. It was home to the Jewish labor movement and most of the stirring hymns that were sung at May Day rallies everywhere. Home to the professional theater with its resident composers, songwriters, sheet music, and later phonograph records. Home to the free press, covering the entire political spectrum from right to left. To the Zeitungsroman, with its huge cast of characters, romantic plot with plenty of sex, and every chapter written in sound bites. To the historical novel, not to speak of the novel of immigration. To humor magazines. To the Little magazine, dedicated to modernist verse and values. To the still small voice of lyric poetry. To the Yizkor book, and to Yiddish children's classics. By home, I do not mean where something originated, but primarily where something incubated. There was Yiddish lyric poetry before Die Junge, but not until Zisha Landau gathered his band of brothers on the Lower East Side was there a self-conscious effort to forge a new poetic idiom dedicated to beauty, music, and the culture of selfhood. Pogroms had entered world consciousness by the 1880s. But the first memorial book, Yizker book, to a martyred community was Churban Proskorov, published in New York in 1924 by the survivors of the pogrom and the Landslide. And the same holds true for the invention of a Yiddish childhood. If you look up Yiddish children's literature in the YIVO Encyclopedia, you will discover that Mordechai Spector and his buddy Sholem Aleichem pioneered the genre with their holiday and cheder-themed stories. But it was only in America that Yiddish children's literature found its most congenial home, where a network of independent schools, pedagogical systems, and publishing houses existed over several decades, where, because they were in North America and not in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, or the USSR, they survived beyond the great abyss that swallowed everything else that was Yiddish. Where a staple of professional writers for children came into being, each with their favorite illustrators, and therefore where the great Yiddish children's classics were produced. All this and more is what the publication of Naomi Prawer Kadar's book invites us to explore. My great passion is literary history. Every course I've ever taught, I've taught in chronological order. It comes as natural to me as breathing. And it all goes back to my Volksschule education, where the two pillars of our pedagogy were Geschichte and Literatur, and where our most beloved teacher, Lehrer Dunsky, taught us both subjects. He is the reason I prefer being called Lehrer Roskies. I am delighted to be sharing this podium for the first time with Yael Darr. Her guide to Hebrew children's literature, Od Sipor Ve'echad V'dai, Madrich Mapa L'Sifrei Yeladim, which was published twice, once in 2002 and then an expanded edition in 2005, is one of my favorite books. And what I love about this book is it's ordered developmentally, organized by reading level, something that never would have occurred to me to do. And gives me an opportunity to acknowledge Yael for the inspiration to do exactly that in my Holocaust literature, a history and guide. The guide is a chronological, developmental guide of Holocaust literature, which was inspired by your example. And it was the single hardest writing assignment because your example was only 500 words per book. And to achieve that level of concision, conciseness, and make it useful and accessible, very difficult for us academics to accomplish. So imagine my joy when I remembered in preparing this lecture that Sholem Aleichem's first story originally written for children was Die Fahne, the flag. And guess when he wrote it? He wrote it in 1900 to usher in the 20th century. It's yet another instance of how Yiddish writers were also hooked into chronology. Why did the invention of a Yiddish childhood coincide with the new century? I think the answer is this. Just as the new century was poised with one face looking forward and one face looking back, so too the concept of a Yiddish childhood was situated precociously, with its face to the future and its back to the recent past. Looking back, what's fun and what's funny about a Yiddish childhood? Well, if to judge from Sholem Aleichem's Die Fahne, not much. To be sure, Topa Letutoritu is something of a comic hero. He's got a speech impediment. There are certain letters he always mispronounces. He's got a thin and squeaky voice. But he is the object of ridicule and beatings. He is subject to torture on the part of his Rebbe. Even Ziama the carpenter tortures him. He is punished for not mimicking the holy gibberish and sacred sounds of the cheder. Society writes him off as a permanent cripple. Childhood, for our hero, is a moral battlefield between desire and deprivation. The desire, the most fervent object of desire in this story, is to have his own flag for Simchas Torah, what he wouldn't give to have a flag of his own. But then he is constantly reminded of his poverty, that he belongs to the lowest rung in the socioeconomic ladder of the shtetl. The cheder becomes the scene of battle between the haves and the have-nots. The story's villain is Yulik, the rich man's son, who is a preacher of pieties. Bist a voil yingel vi ich bin a Yid. You're such a good kid as I am a Jew. Why don't you want to buy a look into my siddur, or for your saved up money, try on my Shabbos-dicken kashketel, my Sabbath hat? And Topele Tutoritu is too astute to fall for that trick. So instead, Yulik bribes Nehemiah, the lame boy, who is a permanent cripple. Childhood is the landscape of intense desire. So after skimping and scraping successfully and negotiating a battle between his Yetzer Hora and his Yetzer Tov, the two, the good and the bad within him, he finally achieves the object of desire and has his own flag, which is lovingly described. It's one of my favorite passages, and I do an analysis of it here in Bridge of Longing, if you're interested, on pages 172 to 173. I won't do it now, but what you see is the child luxuriating on Moses and Aaron in contemporary garb, the Hasidim, the Israelites dressed as Hasidim. It's Jewish folk iconography, in short. Having fun has to do with celebrating the festivals in Israel and imagining the cycle of holidays throughout the year. So at one point, our narrator, who when you will immediately hear is not a child but a grown-up reminiscing about his childhood, describes the Schulhof, what it was like to have all of these houses of prayer in one place in the legendary town of Kasrilevke, where he is from. Unser Schulhof hat zwei Gestalten. In der Wochen ist anders. Shabbos und Yontef wieder anders. So how is the weekday different from Shabbos and the holidays? In der Wochen ist am Mark von Yiddisches Forum, Talesim, Tzitzis und Mezuzes, Fäule, Äppel, Quores, Baralach, Mondlach, Begalach und Zuckerlach, Ziegen zerlegen sich wie beim Taten in Weingärten und seinen Malegere schocklen beschass Meise mit die Berdlach. So that's a description lifted straight out of Mendele. But not what comes next. What's next is vintage Sholem Aleichem. Kommt aber Shabbos und Yontef. Ois Mark, ois Mischer, ois Ziegen, jeden sollen gesund sein, kleiben sich zu neu redlich weiß, me rät und me grage und me erzählt Neues von der ganzen Woche. And then it's the children's turn. So children get to run free, and Shabbos is their day. Why? Because it's carnival. And the holiday is celebrated for its carnival aspects. The shul and the Schulhof is described here as a 5-ring circus. And all of this to lead up to the climax of the one day of the year, which is no holds barred joy for children, and that is the night of Simchas Torah, where all barriers break down between young and old, and boys and girls, and rich and poor. And that is the day when he finally appears bearing his coveted flag. And he gets a special stick from the carpenter, and even the wax he manages to scrimp together so that he can have a candle on the top of his apple, and so on. So he is beside himself with joy. He oversteps the limit. I don't want to spoil the climax, but it doesn't end well. And Sholem Aleichem, or the narrator, actually spells this out at the end of the story as follows. Ihr wisst, Kinder, alle Meises haben a Sof und losen sich euch oder freilich oder treurig. Jiddische Meises losen sich euch zumeistens treurig. Voran bei unser Wörtel, als a Jid du befragt an eure Mann, Tolken ha neue nicht haben. Sie ist a Sach wegen dem zu reden. Als ihr wird unterwachsen, wird ihr gewor werden. Jewish stories must end sadly, especially stories about the lives of the simple folk. And that's what you have to be socialized into when you're reading Yiddish children's literature in the old country. So an imaginary Yiddish childhood in the old country is being exposed to Jewish iconography, but it's only scattered traces of that which still remains. It means celebrating the Jewish holidays as a carnival. It means a Jewish education which is the scene of exploitation, ridicule, beatings, because the real education always happens on the moral psychological sphere. So much for looking back. Looking back means looking to the dark side, to guilt and to fear. And these stories, each one of them is a kind of mini Bildungsroman. It is literally looking back through the eyes of an adult over, usually it's a male narrator, over his own life. What about the childhood of the future? What's the new school of Yiddish childhood? That's when we come to America. America is a paradise for children. You gotta believe it. Maybe it's because America itself is the child among nations. And the great classic of all times is, of course, Shalom Aleicham's Motel, Pesi, Dem Chazans. Still one of the great children's classics of all times, even though it wasn't written for children, but it soon became a children's classic. What's more, it's written in the voice of the child, in his own voice, as it were, in the present tense. So we're experiencing it in real time, as it were. Motel has, like this Janus-faced character, one face looking back, but not for much, and then most of it looking forward. The backward looking is the fact that he is an orphan, and he is orphaned from the get-go. Remember, Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz is also an orphan and comes from an impoverished home. And look where she ends up. So his most famous words, and these are the most famous words in all of Yiddish literature, Mir is gut, ich bin a Yosim. Lucky me, I'm an orphan. You've got it all there. You don't even have to stay for the rest of the Zuma program. You've already got the most important words in all of Yiddish literature. Mir is gut, ich bin a Yosem. The loss of parental authority. His older brother, Elia, is ineffectual. He's laughable, self-important. He can't really control him. As Chonosh Merok explained, he's also an orphan in history. It's a story of a collective undergoing its transition to modernity. Das verjosemte Volk, the orphaned Jewish people, is also collectively embraced in this story. But Motel's essential character is, he is the child of summer, of being out there in nature. Child of eternal summer, and this is Dan Miron's thesis going back to the first book he wrote on Shalom Aleichem in 1971. Motel Pesi Dem Chazans is not a Bildungsroman because he doesn't really change very much. He hardly changes at all. His essential nature remains fixed. It begins with him romping and playing with the calf, the neighbor's calf, whom he names Menye, and the words Beide gleich, beide gleich, beide gleich. We're always together, we're always together, we're always together. And they're romping and praying together and singing together. And what's happening here is this, as in many other works of Shalom Aleichem, it is indebted to his great precursor, Abramovich Mendele. There's the anxiety of influence here. It's Mendele's story, a very late story, Das Teusvis Yontif Kelbale, a story about a child and a goat, verschönert und verbessert, which is to say, Abramovich, being a writer of the old school, was still trying to reconcile nature and the natural world and religious tradition. For Shalom Aleichem, that's no longer relevant. He liberates his child from the tedium of tradition and from its textual baggage. Let's see what a Jewish child is like when he is allowed to be completely free. He is a prankster. He is a bum. He is a master of disorder. He turns the white goats into black. He poisons the town. He loves to be among crowds and carnivals. He loves nothing better than to be at a fair. And his understanding of language here is very important because everything he hears, he understands on a literal basis because he is innocent of language. He is the incomprehending outsider. Jewish culture is something that he has to figure out on his own. What does it mean? Überkehren die Welt, turning the world upside down. Liegen in der Erde und backen baking bagels in the grave? What? Really? And later, ganvenen die Grenetz? What does that mean? To run the border. But my single favorite passage is when he deconstructs the word Gan Eden. Was ist das also ins Gan Eden? What is paradise? So I'll read you this passage. You have to suspend judgment. It's supposed to be a 9-year-old speaking here. The syntax is a little higher than for even the most precocious 9-year-old. But what he's going to do is he's going to take us through 4 stages. Of course, Mother says that Gan Eden is the world to come, where his long-suffering and righteous Father has gone to be forever. But for children, it's a make-believe world. But I've also heard it said that Gan Eden is the Schwitz right before Shabbos. I, on the other hand, have my own take on it. I believe that Gan Eden is the real thing. You can touch it, you can taste it. And here's what Motel has to say. Anu trefft, wo ist der Gan Eden? Ihr werdet nicht treffen. Weißt ihr von was? Weil bei etlichen ist auf ein anderer Ort. Lemoschel, die Mame sagt, als der Gan Eden ist dort, wo mein Tate Pese der Chasen gefindt sich. Dorten, sagt sie, gefinden sich alle ehrlichen Neshomes, wo seine Nebuch abgekommen auf der Welt erfahr, wo sie haben nicht die Welt, kommt sie jene Welt. Das ist doch klar wie der Tag. Fragt sie aber bei meinen Chaverim, wollen sie echt erzählen, meistens, als der Gan Eden gefindt sich ergens auf einem Berg von Sammekristall, hoch bis in den Himmel. Jünglach laufen dort herum, frank und frei, lernen lernt man nicht. Nur man bot sich ganze Tage in Milch und man esst Honig mit volle Häufens. Yiddish is more intermediate advanced. I grant you that. Okay. Seid ihr schon fertig? Kommt zu gehen an Einbinder und tut sag, als der Emerser Gan Eden ist gar Freitag in Bod. Ich hab es allein gehört von unser schreines Mann Moshe dem Einbinder. Ich soll also ihr Herren alles gut. Hein geht er nicht. Mir soll a Steger fragen mich, wollt ich gesagt, als der Gan Eden, das ist Menashe dem Reufes Garten. And then he goes and describes the garden next door with the fruits, and it is, in fact, a place of plenty, and you can eat it, you can taste it, you can steal from it, and that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to steal fruit from the Garden of Eden. So Motel is a child of nature who embraces freedom as his natural right. And that's why he's the only one in the family, when they finally do emigrate to the United States, who can seize the free world with both arms. America replaces his love of Judaism. He will always carry his father's name, Motel Pesidem Chazans. So maybe he'll become an assistant chazan on the high holidays when he comes to America. I think he's going to become a cartoonist for a Yiddish humor magazine. But in fact, we'll never know because Shalom Aleichem died while finishing the novel. In short, Motel translates his love of nature into a love of city life. Du hast gebracht? Oh, okay. So so we won't Manulabe. Manulabe's the second exhibit was supposed to be Manulabe's Yingel Tzingel Chvat. It's a rhymed fantasy about a little boy. Yingel, Tzingel. Chvat means rascal, good for nothing. And it's a work of absolute fantasy. Here is the opening page of which, in fact, all of you will understand. Almost all of you, even those who have just begun, because of its radical simplicity. Manja Leib learned from his master, Zisha Landau, how to write transparent Yiddish verse, to choose a diction which will be universally accessible, and a metrical scheme that will repeat itself and will seem utterly effortless. So this is from one of two illuminated editions. This one, the more famous one, illuminated by El Lisitsky. Chob a meisele ashene, far die Kinder meine Kleine. Seitche Kinder still und scha, sis mein meisele aza. Okay, that's pretty good, right? And the fifth stanza, which already tells you that we're in a fantasy world, where does this story take place? In this magical, faraway town of the past. Und die Goyim und die Jiden haben dort gelebt zufrieden. Wer in Fried und wer in Neut, jeder hat gehabt sein Bräut. So there's no hunger, there is no rivalry, there is only, it's an ecumenical setting. And our Yingel Tzingel Chvat is a kind of, becomes a young magician, and he can transcend reality and rescue the shtetl into the future. The past here is a fairy tale world of a mythic shtetl with a benign rebbe and a jolly poritz. It is intimate and it is very far away. What could American Yiddish writers learn from the example of Eastern Europe? So what we learn from this book is not very much. That in fact, in her chapter, an analysis of the cover designs, Naomi shows you that the covers that they had in Eastern Europe were non-transferable. The body language was wrong. The flora and fauna was wrong. Everything about it had to be reinvented. And there was no gender equality in Eastern Europe. So when you read her book, you discover the first heroines of Yiddish children's literature. Tefes, the youngest daughter of King Solomon, tired of being ignored by her illustrious father, makes a deal with the captive Ashmedai, lord of the underworld, to turn her into a fly. So this is very early on in the annals of Yiddish children's literature. Sarina, skipping ahead 2 decades, by the workmen's circles, Daniel Charney, is a precocious girl of 6. The feisty and independent Sarina has come from Palestine to the United States. Her grandfather represents the axis of the old world. Her grandfather is a rabbi in Brownsville. American Yiddish children's literature, we learn from her book, is replete with benevolent zadis. So my first proposition, to reiterate, is that America was home to much of what we value most about Yiddish literature and culture. And there were competing ideologies, which engendered new, competing magazines, and a whole new literature that came out of it, with homegrown writers and even illustrators, specifically for children. Homegrown folk heroes, starting with Yingel Tzingel Chvat, and ending with Labzig, the red dog, and Vovik, his muzinikal. So, in the interest of time, we're going to skip the middle section. I was going to talk about Yingele Ringele, written by Leon Elbe, and that has a special place in my heart because it was the first book in Yiddish that I read to myself. So that was a major accomplishment, and I think I read it from beginning to end. So it really was a children's classic well beyond its heyday in the 1930s and 40s. I don't, not that young. Not that young. I think I was already 11, maybe 10. No, not that precocious. I wasn't an early reader. I had a lot of trouble learning how to read, in fact, even in English, let alone in Yiddish. So just the rhymed frontispiece. Jingele Ringele, die Chikave wunderliche Geschichte von a Jingele mit a Ringele, was is ausgewen wunder a Heck, und wo die Welt hat a Neck, die Chidushim, was hat gesehen, und alles, was mit ihm ist geschehen, gut für alle Kinder, a viele für Größe, nicht nur für Kleine, worin die meiste ist als eins a Schöne. Okay, so it's for children of all ages. And as Naomi underscores in her analysis of the Yingele Ringele, the theme of homecoming is here very important. No matter how far afield he goes, he always comes back to where he came from. And the Ringele is something that that his parents know about and help him negotiate. So what happens is that through Yiddish children's literature, we begin to arrive at a certain consensus about our place in the world, our relationship to the future, and how we're going to negotiate the past. So Yingele Ringele, his fantasy world is completely absorbed in mythic characters in Eliyahu Hanavi, and it's mostly an Eastern European Jewish landscape. But slowly and surely these stories begin to shift in their focus. And I think if we're looking for an American Yiddish consensus, where we will find it is in Yiddish children's literature. The past is described as good, benign, a place of wonder, of magic, of miracle. Parents are good. They defend you against the dangers of the world. And grandparents are very good because they are your living link to the past. So coming home becomes a major theme in these stories. If we want to understand the process of consensus building, I would suggest that the place to look is in left field. Literally in left field. And Naomi has a whole chapter about Die Linke, the Orden schools, the IWO, the communist-inspired schools. And they had a famous author named Chaver Paver. Okay, Chaver Paver is, as the word would suggest, Comrade Paver. And he has two famous collections of stories about a little dog. So if you're wondering how it is that the ability of Yiddish-speaking children to imagine themselves as a stray urban dog, that will tell you the extent to which the imaginary Yiddish childhood becomes a part of the landscape. In the 1930s, the book that he comes out with is Leipzig, who is a red dog in color and in politics. And I'm going to read what I'm reading to you. I did not write. This comes from the Yiddish Book Center website. I think it was Catherine Madsen who wrote it. It's extremely literate, so I'll just run you through the plot. Leipzig is left abandoned at the Jackson Avenue subway station in the Bronx by a family who can't afford food for themselves, never mind the dog. And he belongs to Beryl the operator, who was a reader of the Morgen Freiheit, and he's always fighting for justice. He prevents a politically paranoid Boy Scout from cutting down the family's portrait of Lenin. Okay, but all told lovingly with humor, in parentheses, a rare thing in most leftist circles. Okay, but that was in 1935. The last of his cycle came out in 1947. It's called Vovik Meiselach von Abronswiller Hinterle, and it was published by his friends in Los Angeles. So let me read you just some of the table of contents. about this Blabzig, who is the youngest son of the Mezinikel of Labzig. So his name is Vovik. Meiselach von Abronswiller Hinterle. Sintele mitten Masel Pintele. Vovik und das Mädele Freidele. Vovik ruft men typisch. Voviken is sehr nicht gut. Vovik wird erhält auf Saratoga Avenue. Vovik in Meise mit der Spiegel. Vovik läuft allemal kein Flatbush. Und so weiter und weiter. So what ends up happening at the very end is this. The last story is a dream in which Vovik dances for the moon. So the moon will lead him back to Coney Island for more of the hot dogs he covets. And that's how the story ends. I would say that the invention of a Yiddish childhood is a singular achievement of American Yiddish culture. This culture should not be judged for its failure to withstand the suburbanization, the acculturation, and later the religious awakening of American Jewry. And I don't think it's fair even to fault the writers themselves for not raising their own children in Yiddish. Many of them did not. Childhood is an imaginary construct. Therefore, our judgment should be aesthetic, experiential, and existential. The questions we need to ask ourselves are these. Would I want to partake of these imaginary Yiddish childhoods? Would I want to raise my children poised precariously and precociously, with one face to the future and another face to the recent severed past? Would I want to be friends with Tefes, Sarina, Motel, Yingel Zingel Chvat, Yingele Ringele, Labzig, and Vovik? Once upon a time, these were the children of my imaginary childhood, along with Peter Pan, Wendy, and the Lost Boys. And I have to tell you, it was a lot of fun.
Thank you, David. I know that it's warm in here, and I think that just stretch your arms a little bit for a second, because I see that some people are stretch them for 2 seconds, and then we'll go to our next speaker. Good? No, we're not going to start with anything. Okay?
I'll be happy to share the water with you.
So our... אפשר? Yael, you mind? Okay, I'd like... Okay, now that everyone has settled, it's my pleasure to introduce Yael Darr, Associate Professor of Child and Youth Culture in the Master's Program at the Porter School of Cultural Studies here at Tel Aviv University. Her studies address children's culture in general and children's literature in particular during the pre-state period in the Yishuv and in the first decades of Israeli statehood. She has published many articles in Hebrew and in English. Her book, Called Away from Our School Desks, The Yishuv in the Shadow of the Holocaust and in Anticipation of Statehood in Children's Literature of Eretz Yisrael, 1939-1948, explores the profound changes in the narrative told to children in Jewish Palestine during the 1940s in light of World War II, the Holocaust, and the transition from pre-state to statehood. Her book, A Canon of Many Voices, focuses on the formation of the first Hebrew canon for children during the Israeli nation-building period. And at present, her main object of research is the wide-ranging transformations that altered Israeli children's the field of Israeli children's literature during the state's first decade. But perhaps most importantly for us here today, Professor Darr is also a graduate of our Zoomer program and an alumna, and has continued to be a staunch supporter of Yiddish studies here at Tel Aviv University and in Israel in general. Her taking a full month out of the summer to attend daily classes in Yiddish, a time that is cherished by most professors to do their own research and writing and just re-energizing, tells us a great deal about her devotion to the field of Yiddish studies and to her intellectual integrity and curiosity. She's a loyal and warm colleague, and Chana joins me and all the faculty of the program in being very grateful that she agreed to speak today. The title of her talk is A Tale of Two Narratives, the Holocaust as Told to Jewish Children in Yiddish and in Hebrew in the early post-war years. Yael.
So, I was more than happy when Chana asked me to take part in this event to mark the publication of Naomi Kadar's book for two reasons at least. First, for 2 wonderful summers, I've been a student in this in the Naomi Prawer Kadar International Yiddish Summer Program, and like many of you, I fell in love with the language. And I'm happy to be back here even for a short visit. So, second, I've been waiting for Kadar's book for a long time. Actually, I heard about it here when I was studying Yiddish here. I think it was Adina Stern who told me about her research that focuses on Yiddish children's periodical published in America during the first half of the 20th century. And as I said, since then I was waiting for it to be published, curious to learn from it about what was probably to be the complete opposite of what I was researching, the Zionist narrative told to children in Hebrew in Jewish Palestine at the same time. Indeed, this wait was worth it. As reading the book thoroughly for this occasion, this reading taught me not only about the deep differences between the two narratives, but also about similarities. Although categorically different, one trying to bridge between American culture and the Jewish Eastern European culture, the Yiddish narrative, and the other overtly negating it, these two intergenerational discourses had some very crucial common points. First, the biographical profile of most of the writers in the periodicals, in the Yiddish periodicals in the United States and in the Hebrew periodicals in Eretz Israel. In both cases, we're talking of members of a relatively young immigrant society. Many of them had left their home countries in Eastern Europe at a young age during the period of massive Jewish immigration from Europe, which began in the early 1880s and continued into the first decades of the 20th century. Most were also sharing a similar social economic background and similar education. Their common Jewish culture of origin was a multilingual one. But Yiddish, people spoke different languages in different occasions. But Yiddish served for most of them as their mother tongue. And in both cases, the Eretz Israeli case and the American case, these writers were now communicating with a young generation that had a different mother tongue, English or Hebrew. In both cases, children were perceived as a first generation of positive change. One growing up in a liberal, open society, another taking part in creating a new Jewish nation in Eretz Israel. Both are offering the young generation radical forms of education. One negating the orthodox way of life by promoting different versions of secular Jewishness. The other negating the diaspora itself, America included, its culture, language, and ways of life. Politics were an integral part of the new Jewish education, and literature was considered a useful tool for promoting the correct politics in both cases. Kadar's books teaches us that within the Yiddish education system that operated in America, Jewish families who seek to teach their children Yiddish had to choose between no less than 4 educational networks, each sponsoring at least 1 children's per periodical. I won't go in to the different networks, but what is important to realize that in Jewish Palestine, the same thing occurred. Education was also very political. There were 3 political streams who had their own schools and their own periodicals. So this political stance towards children and seeing them as political beings was mutual. And when I say regarding them as political beings, I mean realizing or expecting children to know how to distinguish between us and them, between our ideology and theirs. That's being political. So, the different politics and different attitudes towards the old country, nonetheless, led to a deep chasm between the 2 intergenerational discourses. The Yiddish American trying to create a continuity, to extract from the Yiddish culture in Europe values, habits, and tastes, while the Zionist one was starting anew, pushing away the old diasporic influence. Diasporic was really a bad word here, and considered not something you want to bring home. A turning point in this growing split was the Holocaust. One of Kadar's most interesting findings is that in America, the Yiddish newspapers were the first to reveal the Nazi atrocities. She claimed that until the 1960s, in fact, the Yiddish schools in America were the only Jewish educational option to tell about the Holocaust, including information about the horrific events almost as soon as they happened. Kadar beautifully describes the variety of this painful chapter as told to American Jewish children by the 4 Yiddish educational networks. I would like to shortly describe how the Zionist Hebrew option at this period made a dramatic change in its politics and, in fact, for the first time allied with the American Yiddish narrative concerning European Jewry. I would like to claim that in both cases, children were viewed as partners in despair, as Kadar says, and therefore they were not to be shielded from the horror. So, looking at the bulk of Hebrew literary texts for children published in Jewish Palestine during the Second World War, it becomes evident that Hebrew children's literature, too, or children's periodical journalism, too, was preoccupied with the events in Europe, and shared with the children even the very harsh details. Dozens of books for children and youth and hundreds of stories, articles, and poems were published in the children's press between 1942 and 1945 concerning the catastrophe taking place in Europe. These texts had a double purpose. First, they meant to inform as the Yiddish option, tell and update children about the genocide of Jews in Europe. In addition, something different happened here in Eretz Israel. These texts were intended to amend the alienation that the young generation exhibited to what was happening in Europe. Negation, the diaspora negation worked, and children really didn't feel it was their own problem. So very quickly, you see how when information comes in about what's happening, all periodicals change narrative and try to fix damages, actually. So these two aims are apparent in the strong words which the poet and translator Shimshon Meltzer wrote for the Children's Weekly Davar Le'Yeladim on December 3rd, 1942, in the Chanukah volume. His text, an open letter addressed to his young son, was published only several days after the Jewish agency, the Sochnut, published an official announcement in the adult press concerning the systematic murder of Jews taking place in Europe. 3 days, okay? My son, I wish to delight you on this holiday of lights, the day of bravery and hope. But how can I make you happy when my heart is sad? And how shall I conceal from you things you must know? You have already grown, my son, and it is time to pour into your cup of mirth some of the gloom. Taste, my son, and get accustomed, because a grandson you are to a people that suffered great bitterness. From here, Meltzer proceeds to tell his child, apparently for the first time in his life, that he has family members in Europe, and to describe to him the fate of his family. The fact that the boy didn't know of and was not familiar with his family in Europe is, of course, part of the diaspora negation, in light of which children were raised until then. So I continue quoting a little bit more. Son, your father was not an only child for his father. He had brothers and sisters, but only he immigrated, ascended to Eretz Israel. Only he was blessed, and you and your brother were born here under this sky and sun. My brothers and sisters did not come here because they couldn't. Only God knows who of them is still alive and who dead. For there were many children who were brought into an enclosed yard as sheep to the corral, and were shot with a machine gun. And many were put in bags like superfluous kittens and dogs, and were thrown into the river. Son, a great disaster happened there, and is still happening, end of quote. Children's periodical. From the end of 1942, an overall change is apparent in the nature of the familiar diaspora negating stories. As part of this phenomenon, a new literary role was assigned to those who until that time had not been given much opportunity to express their voice, the older generation, particularly grandparents. As opposed to the Yiddish American literature for children that promoted Jewish continuity by means of presenting good family ties between the generations, the Zionist option usually omitted grandparents from the plots. When mentioned, grandparents usually served as a symbolic purpose, as representative of the passive and morbid diaspora. They were positioned as the other in relation to the strong and productive Sabra youth. Now the grandparents were called to center stage in order to tell these grandchildren about European Jewry and weep for it. Two generations now appear, the grandchildren and the grandparents, in a new linkage of love, caring, and attentive listening. Encouraging the new bond between the grandparents and grandparents' generation and the Israeli-born generation was also achieved by using literary models that were based on such a link indirectly. Such is the Jewish folktale, which by nature is considered to be passed from one generation to another. In opposition to the Yiddish case, as described by Kadar in her book, the Jewish folktale occupied only a modest place in the Hebrew children's periodicals published in Jewish Palestine until the war. The folktale's pedigree, as a part of the folk's past, has made this genre an essential asset for Yiddish narrative in the U.S. However, in the Zionist case, due to the negation of the diaspora, the Jewish folktales was considered a problematic sphere. Folktales based on the Bible and the Talmud were welcomed with open hands, whereas tales based on Jewish life in the diaspora were rejected point blank. The new native Sabra culture, therefore, avoided importing Jewish lullabies and folktales which carried a diasporic tone with them and were originally written and sung in Yiddish. In contrast, the war and the Holocaust years are characterized by a very rich collection of Jewish tales that appeared in children's journals. The very well-known story, Simlat HaShabbat Shel Chanaleh's Sabbath dress, was written by Yitzhak Demiel and published in Davar Le'Iladim just before the war broke out. And in the years of the Holocaust, it established itself in the educational literary canon. During that time, the story, which had characteristics of a folktale to begin with, was quickly awarded a status of folklore. And today, many view it as a popular Jewish tale meriting no copyright. The protagonist is Chanaleh, who is given a new white Sabbath dress and is warned by her mother not to get it dirty. She runs outdoors and proudly shows her new white dress to the dog Zuzi, the cow Edna. Then she suddenly sees an old man with a heavy sack coming out of a grove. She shows him his dress, and then it would never work today. I mean, a little girl showing her dress, but that's a different story. She shows him his dress and asks him about the content of the sack. The sack is full of coal gathered from the forest, he answers tiredly. Chanaleh offers to help him carry the sack so he could get home on time for Shabbat. After they part, she discovers that her dress is covered with black stains. She is devastated and bursts into tears. Suddenly she hears the moon calling her. "Do you regret helping the old man?" asks the moon. Chanaleh says she does not regret it, but what will mother say? "Don't cry, go home. Your dress will be more beautiful than ever." The moon sets its beams, and the black stains become spots of shining light. As we see, the tale deals with exactly that positive link between the two generations, the grandchildren and the grandparents. It features an old wondrous coalman and a good little girl from Eretz Israel who helps him. The text intentionally breaks down the diaspora negating dichotomy that was typical of the 30s by combining in a single story diasporic and Eretz Israeli materials. while the old man and his occupation, a cold man bearing a sack, personifies the diaspora. I forgot to tell you he has a beard too. Chanele could be a girl from a moshav in Eretz Israel, and the dog Edna and the cow, the dog and the cow, the names of it insinuate just that. The European forest that the old man comes out from is first referred to as a grove, which is more suitable to Eretz Israel. The fact that the two words are presented as synonyms softens the diaspora Zion previous dichotomy. So, Leah Goldberg, a prominent poet for both adults and children, and a prominent tastemaker in children's literature at the time, wrote about the intergenerational bond necessary for listening to a Jewish tale in an article she published in Mishmar Le'Iladim. That's the more left option of the Labour Party of Darr Le'Iladim, right. Goldberg begins by explaining to Amnon, her child friend, what a folk tale is. I quote, "Folk tales, how can I explain? Here, for example, not long ago I read in a book a story about a man who went to Siberia and by chance came to a small village, and in that village there was a very old woman. She was maybe 90 years old. Her head was full of stories and songs that old people had told her or sang to her when she was a little girl. The woman would gather all the village people and sit and tell them those stories. The stories that the woman told the village people became folk tales. Now she goes on to tell Amnon about Jewish folk tales, Jewish folklore. Amnon asks, and did Jews have folk songs and folk tales? There were many, and a great number of them, not in Hebrew, but in Yiddish, because they were told and sang in the Jewish towns in the diaspora, where Jews spoke Yiddish." End of quote. Thus, Goldberg sanctions both the diaspora and the Yiddish language, stating that Yiddish, which was wholly rejected in pre-war Palestine, now became a part of our Jewish heritage about which we could only long and grieve for. Very similar to the Yiddish periodicals published in the US at that time, as shown by Kadar. So the Zionist Hebrew narrative went a long way as a reaction to the Holocaust. But what was so interesting for me in Kadar's book was to discover that after the war, and towards the establishment of the Israeli state, the Yiddish narrative as well shifted towards the Zionist narrative as part of its effort to offer a positive and promising epilogue to the tragic Holocaust story. She shows how the new Jewish country had become an integral part of the narrative of most Yiddish periodicals. Thus, the two opposing literary options, the American Yiddish and the Zionist Hebrew, that seemed to take diverging roads from their outset, were now sharing much more similar directions. Thank you.
Yes, sure. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience before we move to hear Yuri. I'm sure that the professors can handle their own questions, so I will step back and allow them to field them.
So you talked a lot about the past of Jewish education. So I was specifically thinking about Jewish education today in the diaspora, and mainly my experiences in the U.S. And I was wondering if you think there's like one political or religious ideology that's like hegemonic when it comes to Jewish education, or do you think it's a more diverse field with like more multiple narratives?
No, I don't think it's hegemonic. You would have to, every educational system has its own mythology. Only insofar as English has now become the dominant language. I mean, what can I say? The decline of Hebrew in Jewish education is really what is dispositive. If you don't have access to a Jewish language, you are really extremely limited. That's what we all know. That's why we're learning this other language, so that we can get firsthand access to these sources. So I would say that, the decline of Hebrew literacy, and Hebrew literacy as a value in Jewish education, has a kind of spin-off effect. So you have school systems where the Bible, obviously, and studying the Bible is still central. And then what do you graduate to? What's the next text that is sacred or semi-sacred? I leave that question up to you. And if you don't have the linguistic facility, then you are extremely limited. Then what are you going to read? I.B. Singer's Tales of Chelem, Maurice Sendak. The choices are very limited. So you have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and Haredi, and I don't think they speak the same language or partake of the same mythology.
But I also think, I'm not an expert, but I think that the political, because education was so radical during the first decade, first half of the 20th century, politics were a main issue. I think now it's something that's not considered children's stuff. Children are not considered political, and so it's not so much in there.
What about the religious versus secular thing? I thought that was really interesting. Have you talked about there's a religious awakening? Because it seems like there isn't really a secular Jewish.
No, there isn't. There isn't. Apropos what Yael just said, the classic Hebrew work from the 1940s is, of course, Leah Goldberg's which is completely a personal reminiscence about the children on her own street. And that is the one, you correct me if I'm wrong, that's the one book of the 1940s that is still read today and is passed on from generation to generation.
A lot of it is read.
Yes.
Still read today, but
so doesn't that tell you something, that the one book that she published, which is completely apolitical, very personal, very Tel Aviv it's about, and then in 1966 she published a letter to her readers explaining to them how she came to write this book, and it's almost also an apologia. Here the war is going on, and I'm writing this book about the children on my street. But that's the book that is still read. And I think that tells you a great deal about what we're just talking about.
Old.
Right? What Yael was talking about, and the reason there is this marriage, and it's so exciting to study the two together, is that Yiddish education in America, like Hebrew education in the Yishuv, was collective. Children were expected to be socialized into a collective ethos and to identify with the fate of the collective. That's what they had in common. So in order to do that with little children, you have to inculcate that. So the strategies may be different, but the end game is very much the same. The crucial difference is this, that in America, they're doing it against the grain, because That's not what American education is about. That's not what American children's literature is about. That's not at all. The only group activity that you're supposed to be socialized in America is baseball. John Tunis's baseball classics, because you learn to play and to become a team player. That's about as collective as American education will be. Whereas here, we're talking about the fate of the Jewish people, and the people, and those that, and our grandparents, and the ones who didn't make it across the ocean, and then the mythology of the past. I mean, all of these large constructs which are so non-American.
And thinking of the children reading both literatures, I mean, a Jewish kid in the 40s or 30s was reading American literature and this Yiddish literature, and who demanded completely different things out of him and expected him to be completely different. So I think it was an interesting experience.
I was always bored with the English readers. I mean, reading in second grade Dick and Jane was so stupid compared to what we were doing in the Jewish curriculum that I didn't see the point of learning English. If that's all it was Dick and Jane and all of this.
It's now in Yiddish.
What was your Jewish education in that framework of where did you pick up this interesting Yiddish? Where did you pick up this interesting Hebrew?
Well, this
book.
is.
Oh, you didn't talk about that.
No, I didn't. Well, Avram and I, and Naomi, we were all of one generation that had this exemplary Zionist Yiddish education. We were taught to breathe through both of our nostrils, Yiddish and Hebrew, and Yiddish was the language of instruction for Jewish subjects, and then Hebrew was Ivrit B'Ivrit when you were old enough for that. But our teachers were mostly from Eastern Europe or graduates of a Yiddish teacher seminary. There were two. There was one in New York and one in Montreal. So we actually had a few native-born Yiddish teachers. And the home was still Yiddish-speaking. Almost all of the people that went to school with me, I was born in 1948, so we were a post-war generation, still had Yiddish in the home. And you were expected to speak Yiddish at school. And there were rules about which Yiddish you were allowed to speak. You couldn't speak your native dialect. You had to speak standard Yiddish, which was the Litvish. Are you following? So my best friend Chaskel spoke, his parents were from Warsaw. He was interdialectical. And I had dialect envy as a child because he could speak two dialects and I could only speak one. Because the Yiddish that my parents were from were Lithuanian Jews, and that was the same dialect that you spoke in school. And for whatever reason, this goes back, I think, to Poland as well. The Tzisho schools also had this rule that you were supposed to speak Litvish, because that was proper Yiddish pronunciation. So that was a moment in time. And these were also, Avram and I went to day schools. A day school means it's a total environment. In America, there were no Yiddish day schools. It was an afternoon. You did a lot. It was 2 days a week, and then all of Sunday. It was a lot of hours, but it was an afternoon additional school movement. But we went to Yiddish Hebrew day schools. That was our whole life.
There were what Yiddish day schools were there in the United States or at the time?
Read the book.
In Canada.
In Canada, in Argentina, in Mexico City. Yeah, I think maybe you have time for one more question, and then we'll. Yeah.
So first, thank you so much for both of your remarks. Amazing. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the delivery method. Naomi Prawer Kadar, in her book, talks about the periodicals, and Professor Roskies mentioned a book. And other than immediacy versus depth, how did Yiddish children's literature differ in book form versus in the periodicals?
How the delivery was different. Well, there's a complete overlap. Many of the most popular stories, then, well, all of those serialized ones, like Yingele, Ringele, the Kluger Schneiderl, first appear in multiple installments, and she gives you the exact. She tells you, this Yingele Ringele appeared in 26 consecutive installments. So that way you can actually gauge the popularity of something. If it keeps going for 26 installments and people are still clamoring for more, then your bosses are telling you this should come out in book form, all right? And then once there's a book, then that creates the hunger for more installments of this kind. So I think, the magazines feed off the books, and then the books, I think that's how it works. Is that the answer?
I think the writers took literature very seriously in the periodicals as well. It's not as if when you publish in the newspaper you just, write very quick writing, and when you write a book you because it was a mission.
That's
it
right.
was a very important mission.
And the most important writers wrote for children.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that. It wasn't of a secondary order. Manya Leib. Okay. No, so that's what I had left out of my delivery. Manya Leib, in 1918, this was the annus mirabilis of his career, comes out with a trilogy, 3 little books with identical format. One is called Lieder, that's pure lyric, Balladen, and Jiddische und Slavische Motiven. That's his trilogy, 1918. And then Yingel, Zingel, Chvat comes out in the same year. And the one that becomes an instant classic and is reprinted again and again and again and comes out in 2 or 3 editions in Eastern Europe is Yingel, Zingel, Chvat.
Which was published
one was published in New York, and then the others were published in Kiev and in Warsaw, right? And they're and different illustrators. So writing for children was a highbrow, very serious undertaking.
And was the serialization, was that phenomenon similar in Israel as well?
I can tell you that most of Israeli classics were first published in newspapers. It was the most important way to make literature available to children. So,
And the children volume, they were later bound and used in the library, and they were even kept in the library.
So you read it again and again. You used to keep, save the different issues, and then once a year go to the publisher, to the paper, and bind it.
Well, we've almost come to the end of our time for the symposium. I've been looking around the room, and you do great honor to Naomi's memory by being here today. In one room we have Naomi's child, we have Naomi's teacher, we have Naomi's colleague and avid reader, and in many ways, all of you are Naomi's students. She makes possible, her memory makes possible the generosity of her foundation, the ability of so many people to study what mattered to her, to learn about the world that she cared about, and even to open up new fields as her book is certain to do. I know that there are copies there that Talila wanted me to mention, and there's a sign-up list, and if you want to look through it, you can certainly purchase some
Order the book from the publisher.
and order them. It's called Raising Secular Jews, Yiddish Schools and Their Periodicals for American Children. No Yiddish event would be appropriately concluded without a few minutes of song, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Yuri Vedanyathins.
It's a pleasure and an honor to sing here as we celebrate Naomi Kadar's book. And after hearing two wonderful presentations and being in the same room with my dear teacher, Lehrer Roskies, I will sing a medley that includes parts of a few Yiddish songs that were popular in Yiddish schools. Some of them are specifically designed for little children, so they are very easy to learn, both the lyrics and the melody. So feel free to sing along if you know the song or if you feel you've picked it up on the spot. Because after all, what we have here at this program is also something like a Yiddish school. It is a Yiddish school. It may be, the Svive is somewhat different, but I think and I hope there is some continuity. Kumetale in Yiddish Schule. Die Schule is mit Kinderlach voll. Kumetale in Yiddischer Schule. Die Schule ist mit Kinderdach voll. Ay, 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 mit Kinderdach voll. Der Lehrer hat alle Männer lieb. Lernt die Kinder an ein jiddisches Lied. Ai, dai, dai, ai, dai, dai, an ein jiddisches Lied. Ai, dai, dai, ai, dai, dai, an ein jiddisches Lied. Stellt sich alle Kinder raus, spielen mir in Katz und Mäus. 1, 2, 3, 4, gute Kinder seien mir. 1, 2, 3, 4, Katz und Mäus spielen mir. Meisel, Meisel, komm mal rein, wirst du unser Chaver sein. 1, 2, 3, 4, gute Kinder seien mir. 1, 2, 3, 4, Katz und Mäus spielen mir. Ketzel, Ketzel, geh ja raus, jag sich nach dem Mäus. 1, 2, 3, 4, gute Kinder seien mir. 1, 2, 3, 4, Katz und Mäus spielen mir. Eins und eins ist 2. Kinder, komm, Gicher, komm, alle in a Rei. 2 und 2 zwei, zwei und zwei, zwei und zwei ist vier. Kinder, komm, der Gicher, komm. Gicher, komm zu mir. Gut morgen, gut morgen, gut morgen, alle men, gut morgen, gut morgen, gut morgen, gut morgen, alle men, gut morgen, guten morgen, alle men, guten morgen, alle men, gut morgen, gut morgen, gut morgen, alle men, gut morgen, mir singen a Yiddish Lied, a Yiddish Lied, a Yiddish Lied. Ihr könnt mir helfen? Lo mir singen a Yiddish Lied, a Yiddish Lied, a Yiddish Lied. Lo mir singen a Yiddish Lied. Rai, 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 rai. Wir singen a Yiddish Lied. Lo mir singen a Yiddish Lied. A Yiddish Lied, a Yiddish Lied. Lo mir singen a Yiddish Lied. Ay dai dai ay dai dai ay dai 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 ay dai 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 wo mir singen a Yiddish Lied und mir seinen alle Brüder oi oi alle Brüder und mir singen freiliche Lieder oi 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 und mir halten sich in einem oi oi sich in einem als elches ist nicht bei keinem ay 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 wir lieben sich doch alle oi oi sich doch alle wir hossen mit der Kalle oi oi wir seien freilich munter, oi, oi, freilich munter. Singen Lieder, tanzen unter, oi, oi, oi. Oi, 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 oi,